I am delighted that we're about to go deeper into this afternoon's theme of nature and biodiversity, which of course is a vital counterpart of any discussion of climate change. I'm Clive Cookson, Science Editor at the FT, and I have another great panel of experts for you. With me on my left I'm delighted to welcome Giulia Carbone, who is Director of the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I can see on the screen, we've been joined remotely by Rebecca Shaw, who is Chief Scientist at WWF, who I think is in California at the moment. Yes?
That's right, hello. Thanks so much for having me here.
And also, I think from the Netherlands, we've got Selwyn Duijvestijn. Does that sound right, Selwyn?
That's close.
Duijvestijn.
It's about right. It's good enough.
Duijvestijn, sorry. Anyway, Selwyn is CEO of the Dutch Green Business Group. So my panelists are going to help me look at the latest nature-based solutions, particularly those arising from the private sector. How can they secure more funding to scale up? Why do we often overlook nature as an important contribution to the fight against climate change, as well as being an unfortunate consequence of the world warming up? We've got 40 or 50 minutes for our session, and I'd like to leave maybe 15 or 20 minutes at the end to discuss questions from you in the audience. If you're listening online, please type your question on the screen in the appropriate place, which I think is well signposted, and it'll come through on my iPad. If you're in the room, we'll have someone with a microphone coming to you if you raise your hand. So Rebecca's going to start us off, and I'll begin by asking her, please, to provide briefly some of the scientific background to our discussion. How severe is biodiversity loss now, and how does it relate to climate change? You can't give a comprehensive answer to all of those, but Rebecca, please get us going.
Yeah, this will be a PhD thesis, but I won't take that long to provide an answer. So everyone talks about the biodiversity crisis, and I just want to back up a little bit and make sure everybody knows that biodiversity is a term we use to capture the diversity of life at all levels of biological organizations. So at the very smallest level, from genetic diversity, species diversity, population diversity, habitats, ecosystems, and all the benefits we derive from ecosystems. Lots of times when you hear about a biodiversity crisis, though, scientists will focus on species of a whole array of taxa, like bacteria, fungi, plants, mammals, birds, reptiles, and they all come together to form ecosystems that function at a very high level. And we benefit from these functions in the form of services, ecosystem services that provide regular regional rainfall, clean air, clean water, fertile soils, pollination, timber production, and so much more. Biodiversity is a way of understanding the benefits that flow to people from nature. And when you begin to degrade these ecosystems and remove species through the declines in their populations, you degrade their ability to support our well-being. And long before species go extinct, we have the degradation of the distribution of the size of populations of species and the destruction of habitats, and therefore faltering services. So how serious is it? It's really serious. I mean, if you just focus on species, we are undergoing a sixth mass extinction. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the history of the planet. We're in the middle of a new one, and we're losing species at a rate that's about 10,000 times higher than natural background extinction rates. And these are all due to our human activity. So long before species go extinct, we have that degradation of nature and the faltering flow of nature's services. And Nature is about a third of the solution to climate change, as you heard Andrew Steer talk about in the opening plenary. And so we're talking now about how do we use nature, how do we restore nature and use nature to help us combat climate change, to ensure that we have those flow of services from nature that are undisrupted so that we can thrive. So nature-based solutions are just actions to protect and sustainably manage and restore natural systems to address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity. So it's about using biodiversity to help address societal challenges, such as mitigating climate through greenhouse gas emissions reductions and carbon dioxide sequestration, reforesting mangroves to sequester carbon, protect arable land, improve fisheries stocks, and protect local coastal communities from the shocks of climate impacts, investing and protecting in upstream watersheds to secure water supply and water quality for our communities and cities by avoiding expensive water treatment plants, and restoring deforested and degraded landscapes to deliver improved soil, increase freshwater flows, and carbon sequestration. But nature-based solutions are not just climate solutions. Natural climate solutions are just a subset of nature-based solutions. As an example that I gave previously about reforesting mangroves, natural climate solutions would focus on restoring mangroves for climate mitigation and carbon storage benefits, whereas nature-based solutions seeks to use nature to deliver a broader array of services within a single project: climate mitigation, climate adaptation to increasing storm surge, fisheries production, and soil replenishment. So NBS, nature-based solutions, well implemented, will support humanity in mitigating climate, buffering its impacts, improving soils for food production, increasing water security and availability and quantity, and to protect a myriad of species on the planet, including humans. So scientifically and pragmatically, we know how to measure this. We know how to measure biodiversity at all these levels of biodiversity and biological organization. And for measuring the outputs of NBS, we need to implement projects that are clear regarding their objectives. We need to define the trajectory of those biodiversity recovery that is expected, and to measure the benefits observed. This isn't rocket science, it's earth science, and we know how to do this. We just need to do it at a larger scale and more quickly to address the challenges we face. Interest in nature-based solutions is significantly increased in the past year, given the potential role of helping us achieve the Paris Agreement, of implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity and that nature positive agenda, but also to make sure that we're ensuring human health and well-being across the globe. We just have to scale up to get it right.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a lovely, concise, but comprehensive start. Julia, could you pick up on some of Rebecca's points and talk more about how nature-based solutions work? And in this context, particularly importantly, who's going to pay for them? How are they funded? Selwyn will have more to say about that after you.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's another PhD thesis. We can start the list. The funding of these, so these are really large-scale interventions, as it was mentioned, and they're complex, which doesn't mean that we should shy away, but conservation on the ground is something that really needs a lot of expertise, but also it needs mobilization of a lot of stakeholders. So it's not just going in and intervening. There are a lot of measures that have to be put in place. So first of all, there is all the conservation actions have to be done, making sure that there are not unintended consequences. And this applies to any conservation project. But as we said, a nature-based solution is a large-scale intervention that supports biodiversity. But you have to make sure that, for example, local communities, indigenous peoples are part of the solutions. They are not affected by the solution. So that will require a very comprehensive stakeholder consultation, which is complex and needs to be done seriously, because we don't want solving one problem on one side, creating a larger problem on the other side. So the funding is needed for these projects. And yes, we believe that the private sector can be part of the solution also financially. And this is basically the message that the Natural Climate Solution Alliance, which I lead, is really putting forward, saying how can we integrate funding from business to support natural climate solutions that have to be part of the solution to climate change. So it's not even an opportunity, it's a must. And this is where I think also the conversation that was happening yesterday comes into the game. It's like, we really have to make sure that the flow of funding from business comes from businesses that actually have taken all the measures necessary to decarbonize first their activities, so all, looking at scope 1, 2, and 3, and then look at how much more they can do beyond what is called beyond the value chain, in using SBTI speak. And then this flow can come, and this flow can contribute. I mean, we believe in the NCS Alliance that by 2025, we could basically get to 1 gigaton of contribution from business. And there is much more than we need, because actually the CBD is talking about a commitment to 10 gigaton by 2025. This is, target 8 of what is going to be discussed, by the way, next week in Geneva at the CBD COP. So business can contribute, should contribute, but should really make sure that they channel their funds to high quality natural climate solutions. And that's another complexity, because not every intervention in nature will lead to high biodiversity and therefore the proper carbon sequestration or avoidance that we're looking at. So I think what we need to make sure is that always the word biodiversity is included, because some projects might look at nature, let's say planting trees. It doesn't mean that those will lead to biodiversity. And what we say we want biodiversity is not just because it's a nice to have, let's have some additional core benefit, is because biodiversity is at the basis of success of that project. As Rebecca was presenting, biodiversity underpins the ecosystem services. So that one of the ecosystem services is really carbon sequestration and sinking in nature. And this can only happen in the long term if biodiversity is the assurance that this service will last in the long term, and people. So that's why we are pushing for having this qualifier, saying an NCS really has to have a positive biodiversity and contribution to people and the participation of people to be successful, which of course makes it more complex. It's not a commodity that you can go out and say, let's buy a ton of carbon. A ton of carbon is not going to be equal to any other one. Every project will come with its own specificities. And this is where is really important to raise awareness and educate businesses on how to buy these projects, how to buy these credits in the voluntary carbon market.
Thank you. That's set up Selwyn nicely to talk more specifically perhaps about the private sector's roles. Selwyn.
Absolutely, yes, it's a perfect setup because we are a project developer of high quality, large scale carbon projects, and because the last 10 years it became clear for the private sector that all companies need to go carbon neutral. A lot of companies and larger corporates and both SMEs made pledges to become net zero. And then we come in with our voluntary carbon credits, and we have to explain how they fit into that net zero pledge. And part of our account management team is that we say, okay, solar, wind, electric cars, they're all great, but how is that going to stop deforestation in the Amazon, desertification in Africa? And let's look indeed at that 1 ton of carbon, because one voluntary carbon credit represents 1 ton of carbon. The actual project, there's a lot more to it. And biodiversity plays an enormous role in that. Because yes, if you focus on the nature-based solutions, we can plant trees, we can protect forests, but how is that helping the animals there and the community? And how is that touching on the different species living in that area? So that 1 ton that we all learned what it represents, 1 ton of carbon sequestration, is much more than that. And therefore, the voluntary carbon markets are a great way and a great mechanism to help companies go carbon neutral and net zero, which everyone understands is needed and all the larger corporates pledge to. But then these projects with a lot of underlying focus on both the community, the climate, as well as biodiversity, they fit right in. And I absolutely love WWF's statement on after net zero and carbon neutral, focusing on being nature positive, because that is only if it pays, it stays. And with carbon credits, there's a great mechanism for funding great projects focused on biodiversity, and meanwhile, on the corporate side, incentivize corporates to buy these credits and therefore indirectly fund great projects based on the ground.
So, Selwyn, just to take it a little further, who is investing in your projects? Who's putting money into Dutch Green Business Group's projects?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a very wide range, from the smallest local shops that we calculate their carbon footprint and they invest 500 euros to 1,000 euros, to the larger corporates who have a mandate to invest in 50 million carbon credits, equaling to above $500 million a year. So, and we're focused on all of them. We can assist the small, medium-sized enterprises as well as the corporates. But I would say that the more dirty companies of this moment are leading the way as they see that they need to act and need to invest in these nature-based solutions. So the larger energy firms are at the moment the biggest buyers of credits in the voluntary market.
And this is global, international, or focused on the Netherlands, in your case?
No, absolutely. In our case, we're absolutely global. It's an international market. And both on the project development side and on the larger buyer side, it's a well-known group. But to focus a bit more on that, is what we see now is those companies, they don't go for the cheapest way to offset their carbon. I heard the mangrove projects, for instance, we call them the blue carbon projects. For that same 1 ton of carbon are above $30 per ton. So we see that the corporations, carbon is still the metric transaction here, but corporates look through that and say, okay, we want to fund specifically that high biodiversity because we see the benefits of that, and therefore they pay extra. And again, if it pays really well with the voluntary carbon markets.
Good. Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask all three of you a question now and go back to Rebecca to answer it first, which is to tell us more about how you and we should be evaluating, monitoring all these projects that Selwyn and Julia has been talking about. How can we make sure they're actually having the results, particularly on biodiversity, that is expected and claimed of them, and which people and companies are being paid for?
Yeah, that is a great question, because after all, we do want any projects that are implemented to deliver nature-based solutions, whether it's for climate or for other benefits from nature. We want to make sure they're actually delivering the outcomes that we want them and that we're intended for them. So it's really important to have a really very robust monitoring evaluation and impact evaluation of those projects that actually say, this is what we want to achieve. We want carbon sequestration. We want storm surge protection from mangroves. We want the elimination of saltwater intrusion, so that when you go into a project, you know what you want to achieve. You know, if you manage it in a particular way over the course of 5 to 30 years, that you're going to get this much carbon, you're going to get this much storm surge protection, you're going to get this much other benefits, and that you're measuring all those. One of the key innovations that we're really looking to unlock is, how do you measure those at scale? That is the biodiversity measurement at all those different kinds of biodiversity can be really expensive but we need to figure out how to do it with some combination of in-field measurements, remote measurements, and we also need to be measuring that the projects are actually delivering for the people on the ground that are going to be stewarding the outcomes long term.
Right. Julia, please pick up on that.
Yeah, so in addition to this, because I think the challenge is that, of course, with carbon we have a common metric. With biodiversity, these monitoring and evaluation plans will be specific to the site, or to the area that we are, where the intervention is happening. And the other important element is not just to measure species and the recovery of species, but also very much focusing on the other ecosystem services, because it is important, especially if there are ecosystem services that also support that, for example, adaptation and the resilience of the area and people. So, for example, protection from natural risk, which are also related to, changing climate, are really important. So having a baseline and understanding how the situation is evolving as the project goes. Now, in terms of carbon, I think that's where there is much more, well, first of all, because there is a more common, there is a common metric, and there is a very good understanding of what are the key issues that need to be measured. So, for example, there is the work that being done by the Integrity Council, the ICVCM, that is developing, carbon principles. And then once you have the principles, then you have common metrics or common indicators that you can measure throughout and compare also across projects. But for biodiversity, it will be different. But for biodiversity, what we need to say is that all nature-based solutions, interventions, should achieve a net positive gain. So that, to me, is the common element of all of them. We should all say, if we're investing in nature-based solution, you have to demonstrate that you have a positive gain on biodiversity. And the species will be different, the type of habitat will be different, but that common understanding is that the biodiversity level at the end will have to be improved. That, therefore, will contribute to the resilience of the project, but also to the biodiversity crisis and that being addressed by our colleagues in the CBD.
Selwyn, how are your projects evaluated?
Well, they're always third-party accredited. There are, for instance, the VCS, Verified Carbon Standard, but also the Gold Standard in Switzerland are very well-known for the voluntary market, and we see a shift from carbon credits and the carbon markets more and more towards biodiversity. And we look very closely to Australia and specifically New South Wales, where they have a biobank biodiversity case, where they focus both on species credits as well as ecosystem credits, and then the landowner who is taking care of the stewardship of the land and very much focused on taking care of the land gets rewards. So I think if the biodiversity credits are a solution, and when you focus in on specific landowners that can register their land and their project and their improvement in biodiversity, they get their rewards. And whether that's with biodiversity ecosystem credits or biodiversity species credits, that is a good mechanism to reward the landowner for undertaking the right steps in order to improve the net biodiversity there.
Great. Before I take questions, which I will do soon, I wanted to ask you another sort of big issue, which is how you reconcile the need for biodiversity, growing forests, restoring peatland, etc., and the needs of food production and agriculture. And as you will be aware, this week, unfortunately, in Europe, there's been all the talk about setting aside some of the environmental conditions of the European Common Agricultural Policy, tilling pasture, etc. I don't want to focus just on the here and now, but Rebecca, more broadly, how can we have enough food grown in a way that encourages biodiversity in nature?
Yeah, thank you. We absolutely can. I was really intrigued in listening to Andrew Steer's opening remarks to this section, talking about the big transitions that need to happen. And one of the things that's key in all those transitions is eliminating the waste and the inefficiencies. We are incredibly inefficient at the way we use our land resources, our water resources, our marine resources. And it's really important that we begin to look at getting the most of those resources and not wasting anything. So increasing productivity on existing land where we have food production, making sure that we're not depleting the soils in those resources so they can continue to provide food long into the future, relying more heavily on fisheries and aquaculture for some of our nutrition, to feed people, and making sure that we're understanding, and each community around the globe, each region around the globe, the kinds of outcomes we want. We want to be able to feed the planet fresh, nutritious food, but we also want to make sure that the ecosystem services that underpin the delivery of that food are operating at all scales, at the community scale, at the regional scale, and the global scale, and stabilize the climate. We just have to be a lot smarter with how we use our resources and really undergo those transitions to a new norm where we're more efficient and less wasteful in how we use the resources, including land. So we can do both.
Julia?
Yeah, so again, adding to this, definitely the waste management is a key, but another important condition for success is to have a system-based approach. Because if we go in and just work on a project, the chance that you're going to have spillover leakage effects, just basically removing or moving the problem somewhere else are very high. In the conservation world, and in terms of especially in the voluntary carbon market and conservation, there is this idea of working at the jurisdictional level, which really is by bringing together all the key actors that will set the system and will make sure that if land use is basically, we are talking about another type of land use when we are talking about using land to sequester carbon, right? Therefore, you need to put it in context of the entire system. And therefore, policymakers are absolutely a must role to play, even if business comes with finance. But then these decisions cannot be made by a small, even if it's a big project developer. But this, we are talking about a much bigger problem. And therefore, this jurisdictional approach, or even, in general, the involvement of the policymaker and have a proper land use strategy is absolutely a must.
Thank you. Selwyn?
Yes, absolutely. Agriculture and food production is the topic for the next 30 years. We do large-scale projects in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Cameroon, and the growth in terms of population, when we talk about growth of the population worldwide is mainly because of Africa. We still have that view of the world where we say the biggest cities in the world are London, Paris, and New York, while in reality, in the top 20 cities, 3 of them are in Africa and only 1 is in the more Western world. So in the next 30 years, 1 billion people will be born in Africa. Over a quarter of the people in the world will be born in Africa. So, and they all need to eat, they all need to drink, they all need to stay healthy and keep warm. So with the current issues and the current agriculture use, they will need a lot of focus on how to manage the otherwise there will be a big migration toward Europe, and we don't want that to stay there. So I think this is a very important topic, and given the fact when we speak about biodiversity that a lot of the biodiversity loss is driven by very perverse incentives on monocrop agriculture, for logging, industrial overfishing, I think agriculture, biodiversity, and voluntary carbon markets are very close related.
Can I just add one more point about, natural climate solution? There is the natural climate solution, hierarchy, and actually the most efficient, also cost-efficient solution is to conserve nature where it's already there. But the second one is actually better manage land. And this opens up the opportunity of working in already productive areas such as agricultural areas and help, and increase the opportunities of this area to sequester more carbon or to release less carbon. And then actually the third one is really restoration. So we are talking about how do we actually, it's not either or land, used for agriculture or land used for natural climate solution, is how natural climate solution can support agriculture to, decrease the emissions and enhance the sequestration of carbon. So that's also how we can look at this, and that's why the agriculture sector and all the AFOLU sectors are becoming such an important player. So the agriculture, forest, and other land users need to be part of the solution, also as part of the emissions that they have into their value chain.
Thank you. There are some questions online. I'll take one of them, then I'll open it up to the floor. It's really about lobbying, I think. How can one influence governments to deliver projects for biodiversity recovery and enhancement which offer long-term outcomes rather than the short-term needs of housing and food production and, she says, immediate gratification and appeasement of certain groups of the public? Slightly loaded words, but Rebecca, what's your answer? How do you, WWF is big at influencing governments. How do you do it, and how can we do it more collectively?
Well, I think the thing that the person who asked that question is really getting at is how do you provide the right kind of policy frameworks and the right kind of incentives to push the necessary transitions in the right way so that we can have a whole planet, a healthy people, and a thriving biodiversity and a stable climate. And I think that it is really important that that citizens around the globe are speaking to their governments in a very forthright way about how they think this can happen, what lessons are being learned in other parts of the world that you could draw on in your own backyard, and making sure that the financial flows are lining up with those priorities. I think when citizens speak, and we have a lot of people speaking right now, particularly the youth of the planet, saying we need that they want something different. They want a stable climate. They want a prosperous future, and they want it to be a sustainable one. And they're willing to reduce their consumption to do that. And so I think that we each have our own actions to take on, and we should be actively asking our governments to take on the actions that are appropriate for the governments to take on to support the kind of transitions we need.
Yeah, I think it's, in some cases, governments and can trigger like the supply of these great projects, and again, what comes first? Is it supply or the demand? And maybe, I work with the demand, so the WBCSD is really about bringing in the Natural Climate Solution Alliance is to bring companies that want, high quality credits in terms of the NCS. So it's really maybe about making clear that there is a signal out there and intention to invest a constant flow of funding that will give the opportunity of also countries to say, divest from land uses that are more detrimental to climate and biodiversity, and see NCS as a credible, type of generator of GDP. So it's another way a country can, deploy their resources in a way that actually is going to contribute to a lot of crises. So that's maybe also that kind of conversation that we need to have.
Indeed. Selwyn, do you see influencing governments as part of your role?
Well, we very much fit into the focus on the private markets because I think 20 years ago and for the last years as well, the governments have their way of working. The NGOs and charities have their own great way of delivering good work. But with the opening up of the voluntary carbon markets, there is room also for a free market solution and a for-profit company to assist here as well. Because if you look at some of the nature-based solutions and the great projects around nature that we want to realize and must realize in order to make a real impact, we're not talking about millions, but we're talking about billions. And I think that with the right influence from the private markets, there can be the biggest gains on that side. Nevertheless, keep influencing the governments to do their steps as well.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, great. We've got some questions here. We won't be able to take them all, but we'll here, and then we'll go over there.
Thank you very much. As an ocean lover, it frustrates me intensely because I know about so many of the solutions that can come out of the ocean now, and I also know, obviously, and understand some of the risks and the degradation of our ocean environment. I would love to hear the panelists talk about some of the really exciting investment opportunities that are arising, and also some of the really richly rewarding projects that are going on, because you guys will know better than anybody about how that can help to sequester carbon, restore biodiversity. So I will leave it to you. Thank you.
Okay, panelists. An answer about the role of the oceans. Who'd like to take that first?
Well, I'm happy to start just to say that, yes, definitely we need to also make sure that we are more precise when we say natural climate solution or nature-based solution for climate, we consider terrestrial and ocean. We need to consider ocean. Ocean, and Rebecca can definitely add to that, have a huge role to play in stabilizing, the climate, but also have therefore, a lot of opportunities. I think the challenge is more about the maturity of the methodologies for the carbon sequestration, not so much the biodiversity aspect, but the carbon sequestration. But let's say when mangrove, for example, mangrove conservation and mangrove restoration has huge opportunities in terms of, the biodiversity enrichment of our seas and oceans, but also in terms of the possibility for, other benefits for, related to climate, for example, adaptation because of the protection value. So yeah, we should be more specific when we say it's not just terrestrial, but it's also, marine aspects.
Rebecca, do you want to
add
anything on the oceans?
Yeah, I'm just so grateful that somebody brought it up, because oceans are marine ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems are as important as terrestrial ecosystems and the whole planet solutions that we're looking for. And we're seeing they're often neglected when we talk about food. We need as much robust thinking about the transition of our food systems so that they more fully incorporate the potential of aquatic systems and marine systems for delivering nutritious food for a growing planet at lower environmental costs with greater efficiency. And so the trade-offs are going to be really important. We also need to be looking at our oceans. Our oceans and our terrestrial systems are the largest carbon sinks right now. We need to maintain those sinks and make sure that we're getting more food production and more carbon sequestration out of them than we do now. Lots of really great opportunities, and I would let Selwyn speak to the investments there, but there are a lot of investments in aquaculture, seaweed production that are looking to increase carbon sequestration through those means. And they are at the beginning stages of their development and investment, but I think one of the most important areas for our transition to a sustainable food planet and also a sustainable and stable climate.
Selwyn, briefly, are you doing any investment in the oceans?
Absolutely. We're actively hiring people and experts on the field of blue carbon, specifically focused on conserving mangroves and also the coral reefs. And on the corporate side, when someone comes to us to buy 1 million carbon offsets, we already see that there's a certain percentage for protecting forest, a certain percentage for reconstructing reforestation, afforestation, and the percentage, the need for going carbon neutral through blue carbon is increasing every year. We see about 20% with companies would ask for blue carbon credits. So we're actively looking to develop projects into that area as the methodologies to calculate the right amount of carbon sequestration mature more and more over time.
Okay, quick last question here, and apologies to others.
Thank you very much. I'm Harriet Lamb from Ashton, and I wanted to pick up on this discussion about the food transition. And I feel at the heart of our problems in the food system is that we're simply not paying enough for our food. And in particular, that makes it unsustainable for smallholder farmers in the developing world to switch to more regenerative agriculture. But at the same time, we face a cost of living crisis, even in some of the most wealthy countries of the world, and with fuel prices going higher, it's even more difficult to ask people to pay more for their food. And so what is the systems approach that will help resolve that problem?
Good question. You want to start with that?
Yeah, and well, I think certainly you're talking about farmers, but they are connected to a value chain, and this is where the food sector is the entire value chain, and therefore when we are talking about big enterprise that producing the end product we find on the shelves, they need to connect to their scope 3, which are the farmers, and they have to contribute also to scope 3 decarbonization by, for example, regenerative agriculture, and they have a responsibility towards scope 3. So I think part of the solution is really now that the fact that they are connecting the scopes, and so those who actually buy the resources have to also invest in the resource.
Okay, there's going to be a moment for you to, Rebecca and Selwyn, to sort of have a wrap-up comment either on this or on anything else. And sadly, I've got to close. Rebecca?
Yeah, I just want to point out that the potential here for nature-based solutions to address climate, to address our food transition, and to address biodiversity loss. It's really an important time for us to be thinking about this. The opportunities are terrific, and we do know how to do this, and we need to scale it up and scale the transition. And I'm really looking forward to continue working with all of you to do that in the future. And the last thing I'll say is just that the importance of communities around the globe, people, for stewarding these outcomes into the long term. And so every place where we work, the communities need to be involved.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that. Selwyn, you really do have a quick last word.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the way food is produced over the last 50 years, it changed more than the 10,000 years before that. So I think where we went wrong as mankind is with the industrialization of food production. And that's a topic for a longer discussion, but it lies at the heart of the voluntary carbon markets in which we operate, and I think are a great mechanism for private markets and corporations to invest into these nature-based solutions.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three. You've been wonderful panelists, as I knew you would be. I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Audience, please stay with us. I think we're going to move on shortly to our next session, also on nature, improving the relationship between food production, biodiversity, and the climate crisis. And my colleague Emiko Terrazono, our FT Commodities correspondent, is going to be moderating another excellent group of experts. So thank you all.